16-year-old Leo Phillips stood utterly expressionless as the judge sentenced him to 70 years in prison for burning his grandmother alive. What began as reports of a tragic house fire would soon reveal the teenager's plan to rid himself of the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise him. It would be the discovery of a hidden video camera installed by Cassie Phillips out of growing fear of her own grandson that would capture the chilling moments before the flames engulfed her bedroom, changing everything about how the jury viewed the baby-faced defendant. Cassie Phillips died screaming as flames consumed her bedroom in her Miami, Florida home on the night of October 3rd. The 67-year-old grandmother was burned alive while her 16-year-old grandson, Leo Phillips, watched from across the street as the fire he had methodically set reduced the house to ash and took the life of the woman who had raised him. What initially appeared to be a tragic house fire in the affluent Coconut Grove neighborhood quickly revealed itself to be something far more sinister. The peaceful, palm-lined streets of this upscale Miami community would never feel quite the same again. The fire began shortly after midnight, when most neighbors were asleep in their air-conditioned homes, sheltered from the persistent Florida heat that lingered even in early autumn. Security footage from a nearby home would later show a figure moving around the property, methodically pouring liquid around the exterior walls and focusing particularly on the windows of the master bedroom where Cassie slept. The careful, deliberate movements captured in these grainy images told investigators this was no accident or impulsive act. The timestamps on the footage would later confirm that the arsonist spent nearly 30 minutes preparing the scene, ensuring that the fire would spread rapidly and that all potential escape routes from the bedroom were blocked. Neighbors reported being awakened by the sound of crackling flames and the smell of smoke, with several calling 911 almost simultaneously. By the time first responders arrived, the modest two-story home was fully engulfed, with flames reaching high into the night sky and casting an orange glow across the otherwise dark neighborhood. The intensity of the blaze made it immediately clear to firefighters that anyone inside would have little chance of survival. The heat was so extreme that it melted the siding on adjacent homes, causing neighboring families to evacuate as a precaution. Miami Fire Department Captain Lorenzo Diaz would later testify that in his 23 years of service, he had never witnessed a house fire that spread with such strategic precision. This fire was designed to kill, he stated during preliminary hearings, his normally stoic demeanor visibly shaken as he described the scene. The point of origin was directly outside the victim's bedroom, and accelerant was used to create a wall of flames blocking the bedroom door and windows. This wasn't someone trying to burn down a house. This was someone trying to ensure a specific person couldn't escape that house alive. The medical examiner's report would confirm what firefighters already suspected. Cassie Phillips had been alive and conscious as the fire consumed her room. Soot in her lungs indicated she had been breathing as the fire spread, and defensive burns on her hands and arms showed desperate attempts to escape the flames. The cause of death was listed as a combination of thermal injuries and smoke inhalation. The report estimated that Cassie had remained conscious for approximately 4 to 6 minutes after the fire reached her bedroom, time enough to fully comprehend the horror of her situation, but not enough to find any means of escape. As dawn broke over Miami, casting long shadows across the smoking ruins of the Phillips home, Detective Marcus Wilson of the Miami-Dade Homicide Unit arrived at the scene. The veteran detective, known for his methodical approach and unwavering composure, surveyed the destruction with practiced eyes. What caught his attention was not just the devastation before him, but the teenager sitting on the curb across the street. Unlike the neighbors who clustered together in shocked groups, whispering and crying, 16-year-old Leo Phillips sat alone, watching the scene with what witnesses would later describe as detached curiosity. When Wilson approached him to deliver the news that his grandmother had perished in the fire, Leo's response was a simple nod and a question about where he would be staying now. The affluent enclave of Coconut Grove, with its lush tropical landscaping and multi-million-dollar homes, seemed an unlikely setting for such a brutal crime. The community prided itself on its safety, its excellent schools, and its family-friendly atmosphere. Cassie Phillips had chosen the neighborhood specifically for these qualities when she had taken in her grandson 5 years earlier. The modest home, purchased with her teacher's pension and savings, represented a significant financial stretch for the retired educator, but she had been determined to provide stability for her troubled grandson. What neighbors didn't know was that behind the carefully maintained exterior of the Phillips home, a troubling dynamic had been developing. School records would later reveal that Leo had been suspended 3 times in the previous year for fighting, with one incident serious enough to result in another student requiring stitches. Cassie had sought help through therapy and medication, attending every parent-teacher conference, and cooperating fully with school counselors. Her determination to help her grandson had been unwavering, even as his behavior grew increasingly concerning. As investigators processed the scene, they discovered several details that immediately raised suspicions about the fire's origin. The pattern of burn marks around the home's perimeter indicated a deliberate application of accelerant, focusing particularly on exits from the structure. Most telling was the concentration of accelerant outside Cassie's bedroom window and door, creating what fire investigators termed a fire trap designed to prevent escape. The careful placement of these accelerants required knowledge of the home's layout and Cassie's sleeping habits, immediately narrowing the focus to someone familiar with both. The sun rose higher over Miami's skyline as news crews began to gather at the perimeter of the crime scene. Local reporters, sensing a story beyond the typical house fire, began broadcasting live updates, describing the tragic death of a beloved retired teacher. At this early stage, they characterized Leo as the fire's second victim, a boy who had lost everything in a terrible accident. This narrative would soon change dramatically. As Detective Wilson watched the teenager from across the yellow crime scene tape, he noticed something disturbing. When the cameras turned toward Leo, the boy's blank expression shifted, his posture changed, and tears appeared on cue. Cassie Phillips had dedicated 42 years of her life to teaching 3rd grade at Palmetto Elementary School before retiring at the age of 62. Colleagues remembered her as the teacher who arrived earliest and left latest, who volunteered for every committee, and who spent her own money on classroom supplies when school budgets fell short. Her classroom walls had been covered with colorful art projects and inspirational quotes, creating what one former student described as a place where you felt safe to learn and make mistakes. Cassie had never married, pouring all her maternal energy into generations of young students who passed through her classroom, and later, into raising her troubled grandson. Former students and parents flooded social media with tributes in the days following her death, sharing stories of her kindness and dedication. One mother recounted how Cassie had tutored her son with dyslexia after school for an entire year, refusing any payment, and instead asking the family to pay it forward by helping someone else. Another former student, now a teacher himself, credited Cassie with saving him from a path of delinquency, describing how she had recognized his potential when everyone else had written him off as a troublemaker. Mrs. Phillips saw the best in everyone, and he wrote, in a widely shared post, even when we couldn't see it in ourselves. Cassie's life had taken an unexpected turn 5 years before her death, when her only daughter, Lisa, lost custody of Leo due to ongoing substance abuse issues. Without hesitation, Cassie had stepped forward to take custody of her then 11-year-old grandson, postponing the travel plans she had been looking forward to in retirement. Friends recalled her determination to provide Leo with stability and opportunities, despite the significant adjustments required in her own life. "She never complained, not once," said Gloria Martinez, a fellow retired teacher and Cassie's closest friend. "She would just say that this was what family does, and that Leo deserved a chance at a normal life." What few people knew was how challenging that transition had been for both Cassie and Leo. The boy had already experienced significant trauma and instability living with his mother, witnessing her struggles with addiction and cycling through periods of homelessness and temporary housing. School records from that time indicated frequent absences, behavioral issues, and academic struggles that suggested a child in crisis. Cassie had approached the situation with the same methodical care she had brought to her teaching, seeking therapy for Leo, creating consistent routines, and advocating fiercely for support services at his school. In the quiet moments between Cassie's busy days of raising a troubled teen, she maintained her passion for gardening, transforming her modest backyard into what neighbors called an urban oasis. The garden became her refuge, a place where she could find moments of peace amid the increasing stress at home. Tropical flowers in vibrant oranges and pinks lined meticulously maintained pathways, creating a haven that reflected her nurturing spirit. The garden, like everything Cassie touched, was an expression of patient care and attention to detail. After her death, investigators found detailed photo albums in a fire-resistant safe that had survived the blaze. These albums documented not just Cassie's life, but contained photographs and mementos from Leo's childhood that she had carefully collected and preserved. One album was dedicated entirely to Leo's mother, Lisa, containing photos from happier times, along with letters Lisa had written during brief periods of sobriety. Cassie had preserved these memories for Leo, ensuring he would have connections to his past and evidence that he had been loved, even during the most difficult times. The financial records recovered from Cassie's bank revealed the practical sacrifices she had made to provide for her grandson. She had delayed necessary dental work, continued driving an aging car that frequently needed repairs, and withdrawn from her retirement savings to pay for Leo's therapy sessions when insurance coverage ran out. Her monthly budget, meticulously maintained in a ledger found in her desk, showed every penny accounted for, with her own needs consistently minimized to prioritize Leo's. The final entry, dated just 2 days before the fire, noted expenses for Leo's upcoming college application fees. While Cassie's external life presented an image of a dedicated grandmother making the best of a difficult situation, her private journals revealed growing concerns about her grandson's behavior. Entries from the months leading up to her death described discovering mutilated animals in the backyard, money missing from her purse, and disturbing drawings hidden in Leo's room. "I don't know who to turn to," she had written just 3 weeks before her death. "If I report these incidents, they might take him away, and I'm afraid of what would happen to him in the system. But I'm beginning to fear what might happen if he stays." Miami-Dade County School District records showed that Cassie had attended every parent-teacher conference and responded immediately to any concerns raised by school staff. She had advocated for additional testing when Leo showed signs of learning difficulties and had arranged her schedule to transport him to weekly therapy appointments. Teacher notes indicated that she frequently checked in via email for updates on his behavior and academic progress, demonstrating a level of parental involvement that teachers described as exemplary. What these same records didn't show was how these efforts were increasingly met with resentment and opposition from Leo himself. Cassie's last public appearance had been at a community meeting about teen mental health services just 1 week before her death. Several attendees later recalled her asking pointed questions about resources for families dealing with adolescents exhibiting violent tendencies. She was very careful with her wording, remembered Community Center Director Raul Mendez, but those of us who work with troubled teens could tell she was describing a potentially dangerous situation at home. The meeting had concluded with Cassie accepting resource pamphlets and scheduling a private consultation that would never take place. The tragedy of Cassie Phillips extended beyond her horrific death to the painful irony that she had been killed by the very person she had sacrificed everything to save. Her life had been defined by nurturing children, by believing in their potential, even when evidence suggested otherwise. Friends would later describe her as someone who always saw the best in others, who believed that, with enough love and support, any child could thrive. Her unwavering commitment to this belief, even in the face of mounting evidence that Leo posed a danger, ultimately cost Cassie her life in the most painful way imaginable. The 911 call came in at 12:17 in the morning, the caller's voice rising with panic as she described the flames engulfing her neighbor's home. "Please hurry, the whole house is on fire, and I think Mrs. Phillips is still inside," urged Sophia Rodriguez, a nurse who lived 2 doors down from the Phillips residence. The dispatcher calmly collected the address and details while simultaneously dispatching Miami-Dade fire rescue units that would arrive on scene 4 minutes later. As Rodriguez remained on the line, she suddenly noticed something that would later become crucial evidence. Wait, her grandson is just standing across the street watching. Shouldn't he be trying to help or something? First responders described a scene of complete chaos as they arrived at the upscale Coconut Grove neighborhood with flames visible from blocks away, and neighbors in various states of dress gathered on the street. Fire Captain Lorenzo Diaz immediately recognized the severity of the situation, calling for additional units as his team began their assault on the blaze that had already compromised the home's structural integrity. Police officer Alicia Fernandez was the first to approach Leo Phillips, who was standing under a royal palm tree across from the burning house, his expression described in her report as unnervingly calm. When asked if anyone was inside the house, Leo had replied, "My grandmother sleeps with her door locked," without volunteering any additional information or displaying visible distress. The initial hours of the investigation unfolded against the backdrop of firefighters battling the persistent blaze, which resisted their efforts with unusual intensity. Heat sensors detected temperatures exceeding 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit, particularly around the master bedroom area, indicating the presence of accelerants. As dawn approached and the fire was finally contained, investigators made the grim discovery of Cassie Phillips's body positioned near her bedroom window in what appeared to be a final attempt to escape. The scene was so disturbing that even veteran firefighters requested a moment to compose themselves before continuing their work. Miami's morning traffic crawled past the cordoned-off street as Detective Marcus Wilson arrived to take charge of what was quickly transitioning from a fire investigation to a potential homicide case. Wilson, a 23-year veteran of the Miami-Dade Police Department with a specialty in arson-related homicides, immediately noted several concerning elements at the scene: the concentration of burn patterns, the multiple points of origin, and, most tellingly, the lack of emotional response from Cassie's only known relative, all raised immediate red flags. "Experience tells you when something doesn't add up," Wilson would later testify, and everything about this scene was screaming that this was no accident. The vibrant Miami morning, with its characteristic humidity and brilliant sunshine, created a surreal contrast to the charred remains of the Phillips home, as crime scene technicians began their methodical processing of the site. Wearing protective suits and respirators against the toxic residue of the fire, they collected samples from various burn points, photographed pattern evidence, and carefully documented the scene before the unstable structure could collapse further. Their initial field tests confirmed the presence of gasoline as an accelerant, applied with what appeared to be deliberate precision around potential exit points from the home. Detective Wilson's initial interview with Leo Phillips took place in the back of a police cruiser at the scene, a conversation that would later be scrutinized in court. The 16-year-old claimed he had spent the evening at his friend Jason Miller's house, returning home around midnight to find the house already in flames. When asked why he hadn't called 911 himself, Leo shrugged and said, "Someone else was already calling." Wilson noted in his report that throughout the 20-minute preliminary interview, Leo showed no tears, asked no questions about his grandmother's condition, and seemed primarily concerned about retrieving his gaming console from his bedroom if it had survived the fire. By mid-morning, the medical examiner's mobile unit had arrived to remove Cassie's body, an event that drew Leo's attention for the first time since Wilson had been observing him. According to Officer Fernandez, who was assigned to stay with the teenager, Leo had watched the body removal process with unusual intensity, even attempting to move closer for a better view before being gently redirected. This behavior triggered the first formal notation in the case file regarding behavioral concerns, with Fernandez writing, "Subject displays inappropriate affect and concerning interest in victim's remains." The observation would later form part of the psychological evaluation used by the prosecution. As the day progressed, Detective Wilson dispatched officers to verify Leo's alibi, while others canvassed the neighborhood for witnesses and security camera footage. The first significant break came when Jason Miller's parents confirmed that while Leo had indeed been at their home earlier in the evening, he had left around 10:30, not midnight as he had claimed. This time discrepancy opened a critical window of opportunity during which the fire could have been set. Additionally, the Millers reported that Leo's behavior that evening had seemed unusual, with Jason's mother noting that he had repeatedly asked about the distance between their home and his grandmother's, questioning if a fire would be visible from that far away. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Officer Carlos Velez recovered security footage from a Shell gas station less than a mile from the Phillips home. The timestamp showed Leo purchasing a red plastic gas container and 3 gallons of gasoline at 11:07 p.m., less than an hour before the fire was reported. The teenager had paid in cash, but had used his student ID discount card out of habit, creating an electronic record of the transaction. When confronted with this evidence later that afternoon, Leo claimed the gasoline was for his friend's dirt bike, though he couldn't explain why this purchase wasn't made while he was actually with his friend, or why the gas container was nowhere to be found. By the first evening of the investigation, Detective Wilson had gathered enough preliminary evidence to justify taking Leo into custody for further questioning. The decision wasn't made lightly. As a minor, Leo had additional legal protections, and with no living relatives immediately available, the Department of Children and Families had to be involved. Under Florida law, Wilson had 48 hours to either charge Leo or release him to state custody, creating intense pressure to solidify the evolving case. "We needed to move carefully but quickly," Wilson later explained. "We had a suspect without any apparent emotional attachment to the victim, physical evidence placing him with an accelerant shortly before the fire, and a compromised alibi. What we didn't yet have was a clear motive or the smoking gun that would definitively tie him to the scene." Detective Marcus Wilson sat across from Leo Phillips in interview room B of the Miami-Dade Police Department, the sterile environment, a stark contrast to the chaos of the fire scene 12 hours earlier. Though juvenile interviews typically required the presence of a parent or guardian, the circumstances had necessitated the appointment of a court-designated child advocate who sat silently next to the teenager. Wilson, known for his ability to connect with young offenders, started with simple, non-threatening questions about Leo's life with his grandmother. The detective noted that Leo spoke about Cassie in clinical terms, describing their living arrangement as mutually beneficial, rather than expressing any emotional connection or grief over her violent death. The shift in the interview came when Wilson placed still images from the gas station security footage on the table between them. "I'd like you to explain this," Wilson said, watching as Leo's practiced composure momentarily slipped. The teenager initially claimed not to remember the purchase before quickly pivoting to the story about buying gas for a friend's dirt bike. When Wilson pointed out the timing discrepancy that Leo had claimed to be at his friend's house when the purchase was made, the first cracks in his facade appeared. "Maybe I got the times mixed up," Leo offered, his previously steady voice rising slightly as he shifted in his chair. As the interview progressed, Wilson methodically dismantled Leo's timeline of the previous evening. Security cameras from the upscale neighborhood had captured Leo walking toward his grandmother's house at approximately 11:30 p.m., carrying what appeared to be the red gas container from his earlier purchase. When confronted with this evidence, Leo's demeanor changed dramatically. "You don't understand what it was like living with her," he blurted out, before the child advocate could intervene. "She had all these rules and expectations, always watching everything I did like I was some kind of prisoner." The forensic analysis of Cassie Phillips's smartphone revealed a pattern that contradicted Leo's characterization of her as controlling. Text messages between grandmother and grandson showed Cassie primarily checking on his whereabouts for safety reasons, offering transportation, and inquiring about meal preferences. In contrast, Leo's responses were increasingly hostile in the weeks leading up to the fire, with the final exchange occurring just hours before her death. "Stop tracking me," he had written, in response to Cassie asking what time he would be home for dinner. "You won't have to worry about me much longer anyway." While the interview with Leo continued at police headquarters, a secondary team of investigators had been granted a warrant to search Jason Miller's home, where they discovered a notebook hidden between the mattress and box spring in the guest room where Leo often stayed. The notebook contained detailed drawings of fire spreading through what appeared to be Cassie's house, with particular attention paid to the master bedroom. More disturbing were the handwritten notes analyzing different accelerants and their burn rates, along with calculations about how quickly smoke would render someone unconscious. When this evidence was presented to Leo, he claimed the notebook was for a creative writing project, though his school records showed he wasn't enrolled in any such class. The investigation gained further momentum when Detective Wilson interviewed Leo's teachers and school counselor, uncovering a pattern of concerning behavior that had escalated in recent months. School counselor Dr. Gabriela Sanchez revealed that Leo had been required to attend weekly sessions following an incident where he had threatened another student with a chemistry class scalpel. During these sessions, Leo had occasionally mentioned feeling trapped by his grandmother's expectations and had once asked theoretical questions about inheritance laws for minors. Dr. Sanchez had documented these conversations and shared her concerns with Cassie, who had increased Leo's therapy sessions in response. A search warrant executed on Leo's personal computer revealed search history that prosecutors would later describe as a methodical research project in murder. In the 3 weeks leading up to the fire, Leo had searched for information about smoke inhalation, the flammability of different household materials, and whether arson could be disguised as an electrical fire. Most damning was a search from just 5 days before the fire. Can someone survive if bedroom is on fire? The digital forensics team also recovered deleted videos where Leo had recorded test fires in a wooded area behind his school, narrating the results as if conducting scientific experiments. The financial angle of the case emerged when investigators discovered that Cassie had recently modified her will, placing the majority of her modest estate and a $200,000 life insurance policy in a trust for Leo's college education. The trust stipulated that funds would be released in increments based on academic performance and would require approval from a trustee, Cassie's sister, who lived in Oregon. This arrangement would have prevented Leo from accessing the money directly, even after turning 18. Of particular interest to investigators was that Leo had accessed Cassie's home office computer and viewed these documents 2 weeks before the fire based on digital timestamps. By the 48-hour mark of the investigation, Detective Wilson had compiled enough evidence to charge Leo Phillips with first-degree murder and arson. The decision to charge him as an adult was made by the state attorney's office after reviewing the extensive evidence of premeditation and the extreme cruelty of the crime. Prosecutor Victoria Barnes, assigned to lead the case, described the evidence as overwhelming and disturbing, pointing to a level of calculation rarely seen even in adult offenders. The announcement of these charges generated immediate media attention, with national news outlets descending on Miami to cover the story of the teenager who had allegedly burned his grandmother alive. The most compelling piece of evidence came from an unexpected source, Cassie Phillips herself. In a final interview with neighbors who had been close to the victim, detectives learned that Cassie had become increasingly concerned for her safety in the weeks before her death. One neighbor revealed that Cassie had installed a small security camera in her bedroom after finding her personal items disturbed and her prescription medications tampered with. The camera, designed to look like an alarm clock, had uploaded its footage to a cloud storage account. The final video recovered from this account, time-stamped just minutes before the fire, showed Leo opening Cassie's bedroom door, making eye contact with his sleeping grandmother, and quietly closing and locking the door from the outside before the footage abruptly ended. Prosecutor Victoria Barnes sat at her desk in the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office, surrounded by meticulously organized evidence files for the case against Leo Phillips. The 38-year-old prosecutor, known for her methodical approach and perfect conviction record in homicide cases, had been personally selected by the state attorney to handle what was quickly becoming one of the most high-profile trials in recent Florida history. Sunlight streamed through her office window, illuminating the crime scene photo she was reviewing with a golden Miami glow that seemed inappropriately cheerful given the horrific nature of the evidence before her. The case was strong, but Barnes knew that prosecuting a juvenile for a crime of this magnitude would bring additional challenges and scrutiny. The forensic evidence formed the backbone of the prosecution's case, beginning with the fire investigation report that definitively classified the blaze as incendiary, deliberately set with the intent to destroy property and cause harm. Fire pattern analysis showed that accelerant had been poured in a deliberate pattern around Cassie's bedroom door and windows, creating what fire investigators termed a fire trap with no possibility of escape. Gas chromatography tests confirmed that the accelerant was the same type of gasoline sold at the Shell station where Leo had been recorded making his purchase. Most damning was the recovery of melted plastic residue in the debris that matched the composition of the red gas container Leo had purchased hours before the fire. The digital evidence against Leo grew as investigators continued their analysis of his online activities and electronic devices. His search history revealed not just research about fire and arson, but specific queries about his grandmother's medication, including whether certain sleep aids would prevent someone from waking during a fire. Text messages recovered from his phone showed conversations with friends where he complained about living with Cassie, including one message sent just 3 days before the fire that read, "I've figured out a permanent solution to my grandmother problem." When the recipient asked what he meant, Leo had replied with a fire emoji, followed by the words, "Freedom soon." Barnes worked closely with the medical examiner's office to build a comprehensive understanding of exactly how Cassie Phillips had died, information that would be crucial for establishing the especially heinous nature of the crime. The autopsy findings were difficult to process, even for experienced professionals, detailing how Cassie had likely awakened as the fire spread, only to find her bedroom door locked from the outside. Analysis of soot patterns in her lungs indicated she had been conscious and breathing for several minutes as the room filled with smoke and flames. Burns on her hands and injuries to her fingernails showed desperate attempts to escape through the window, which had also been doused with accelerant from the outside. The prosecutor's case was strengthened by psychological evaluations of Leo conducted after his arrest. While the defense would likely argue diminished capacity due to mental illness, the state's psychiatrist found that Leo exhibited classic traits of antisocial personality disorder with narcissistic features, but no evidence of psychosis or any condition that would prevent him from understanding the wrongfulness of his actions. The evaluation noted Leo's profound lack of empathy and calculation beyond his years, concluding that he represented an ongoing danger to society. Most concerning to Barnes was the psychiatrist's assessment that Leo appeared to take pride in the sophisticated planning of his crime, seeing it as evidence of his intellectual superiority. Witness testimony would provide the human context for the physical evidence, painting a picture of a teenager who had become increasingly hostile toward the grandmother who had sacrificed everything for him. Cassie's fellow teachers described witnessing uncomfortable interactions where Leo would publicly undermine and embarrass his grandmother. Neighbors reported overhearing shouting matches in which Leo's voice dominated, with threats such as, "You'll be sorry," and "I could hurt you if I wanted to," clearly audible through open windows. One particularly damning account came from Cassie's hairdresser, who had photographed unusual bruising on Cassie's arms during her last appointment, bruising that Cassie had dismissed as just being clumsy. The evidence timeline Barnes constructed showed the methodical nature of Leo's planning over a 3-week period, beginning with online research, progressing to testing materials in the woods behind his school, purchasing the necessary supplies, creating a false alibi, and finally executing the crime with precision on a night when neighborhood outdoor cameras would be partially obscured by heavy foliage due to predicted high winds. This level of planning directly contradicted the defense's likely argument that this was an impulsive act by a troubled teen. "This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment," Barnes told her team during a case review. "This was a campaign of calculated actions leading to a predetermined outcome." Perhaps the most compelling evidence came from Cassie's own security measures, installed out of growing fear of her grandson. The bedroom camera, disguised as an alarm clock, had captured not only the final moments before the fire, but also previous incidents of Leo entering her room while she slept, standing over her bed, and on one occasion holding a pillow while watching her breathe before apparently changing his mind and leaving. The cloud-stored footage, which Leo had been unaware of, provided chilling insight into his escalating behavior and established that the fire was the culmination of previous abandoned attempts rather than an isolated incident. The financial motive became clearer as investigators uncovered Leo's online activities following his discovery of Cassie's will and life insurance policy. His search history revealed queries about how trusts could be broken and whether being charged as a juvenile would affect inheritance rights. Most disturbing was a document found on his school laptop where he had calculated how much money would be available to him if he could gain direct access to Cassie's estate, followed by a list of luxury items he planned to purchase. The document was titled After C, which prosecutors believed referred to After Cassie. While building her case, Barnes anticipated the defense's likely strategy of portraying Leo as a victim of his early childhood experiences with his addicted mother. To counter this narrative, she compiled evidence of the extraordinary efforts Cassie had made to provide stability, including paying for extensive therapy, maintaining communication with his school counselors, and creating detailed routines to help him succeed. School records showed Cassie had never missed a parent-teacher conference and had advocated tirelessly for additional support services for Leo. The prosecution would argue that rather than being neglected or abused, Leo had been given every possible advantage by a grandmother who had restructured her entire life to accommodate his needs. As the case moved toward trial, the final piece of the prosecution's puzzle fell into place when Jason Miller, Leo's friend and initial alibi, agreed to testify in exchange for immunity from charges of obstruction of justice. Miller admitted that Leo had asked him to lie about the time he left Miller's house on the night of the fire, initially presenting it as a way to cover for a romantic meeting with a girl. More disturbingly, Miller revealed that in the weeks before the fire, Leo had spoken hypothetically about the perfect murder and had asked Miller how he would get rid of someone if he needed to. This testimony would establish not only Leo's intent, but also his awareness of the wrongfulness of his actions, as evidenced by his efforts to create a false alibi. The formal arrest of Leo Phillips took place at Coral Gables Senior High School, a decision made deliberately by Detective Marcus Wilson to minimize the potential for the teenager to destroy evidence or flee. School resource officers quietly removed Leo from his advanced placement chemistry class, where classmates later reported he had been calmly taking notes on combustion reactions just moments before. The 16-year-old was escorted to an administrative office where Wilson waited with a female detective and a representative from the Department of Children and Families. Students in nearby classrooms described seeing Leo walk down the hallway in handcuffs, his expression neutral, his posture straight, as if being escorted to an award ceremony rather than facing arrest for murder. At Miami-Dade Police Headquarters, Leo was processed according to juvenile protocols despite the decision to charge him as an adult. His fingerprints and DNA were collected, and he was photographed for his mugshot, an image that would soon circulate widely in the media, striking viewers with the disconnect between his boyish appearance and the monstrous nature of his alleged crime. Throughout the booking process, officers noted Leo's unusual composure, with one describing him as the calmest suspect I've processed in 15 years on the job. When asked if he understood why he was being arrested, Leo reportedly replied, "Obviously for my grandmother's death," without emotion or further elaboration. The formal interrogation room at headquarters was deliberately designed to be intimidating, windowless, sparsely furnished, and illuminated by harsh fluorescent lighting that cast unflattering shadows on its occupants. Detective Wilson, accompanied by Assistant State Attorney Daniela Rodriguez, entered the room where Leo sat with his court-appointed attorney, Michael Greenberg. Florida law required the presence of legal counsel during the questioning of a juvenile facing adult charges, a procedural protection that Wilson was careful to document for the eventual trial. The video recording system captured multiple angles of the room, ensuring that every expression, movement, and statement would be preserved for jurors to evaluate. Wilson began the interrogation with a strategy he had developed over decades of interviewing young offenders, establishing a factual baseline before addressing the crime itself. He asked Leo about his daily routine, his academic interests, and his relationship with his grandmother, questions designed to both set a conversational tone and gather insights into Leo's personality. Throughout these preliminary questions, Leo maintained a relaxed demeanor, speaking in full, articulate sentences that reflected his above-average intelligence. When discussing his academic achievements, He became notably more animated, sitting up straighter and making direct eye contact as he detailed his 4.0 GPA and plans to study chemical engineering. The detective's approach shifted subtly as he transitioned to discussing the night of the fire, introducing physical evidence piece by piece while observing Leo's reactions. "We have you on camera purchasing gasoline and a container at 11:07 p.m., Wilson stated, sliding the security footage still across the table. Leo's attorney immediately advised him not to respond, but Wilson noted a momentary tightening around the teenager's eyes, the first crack in his composed facade. "We also have footage of you approaching your grandmother's house at 11:30 p.m., carrying what appears to be that same container," Wilson continued, presenting the neighborhood security camera image. "Would you like to explain that?" Despite his attorney's continued advisement to remain silent, Leo began to engage with the evidence presented, a common mistake made by suspects who believe in their intellectual superiority over investigators. "That could be anyone," he said, regarding the neighborhood footage, which showed a figure whose face was partially obscured by the hood of a sweatshirt. The detective then presented cell phone tower data that placed Leo's phone near his grandmother's house during the critical time period, directly contradicting his previous alibi. For the first time since his arrest, Leo showed visible frustration, his right hand curling into a fist beneath the table as he glanced toward his attorney. The pivotal moment in the interrogation came when Wilson revealed the existence of Cassie's hidden bedroom camera. "Your grandmother was afraid of you, Leo," he said quietly, watching as the teenager's expression froze. "Afraid enough that she installed a security camera disguised as an alarm clock beside her bed. Did you know that?" The video recording of the interrogation captured the subtle but significant change in Leo's breathing pattern, the first indication that he was experiencing genuine stress. "That camera captured you entering her room the night of the fire, locking her door from the outside," Wilson continued, though he deliberately withheld the fact that the actual footage ended before showing this specific action, a strategic deception permitted under interrogation protocols. Leo's attorney called for a brief consultation with his client, their whispered conversation just barely audible on the interrogation room's sensitive microphones. Upon returning to questioning, Leo's demeanor had noticeably shifted. His previous confidence appeared diminished, replaced by a calculated caution in his responses. He began to construct a new narrative, suggesting that he had indeed returned home that night, but had found the house already on fire. "I panicked," he claimed, his voice taking on an emotional quality that had been absent previously. "I should have called 911, but I was scared people would blame me because of arguments we'd had." Wilson, recognizing the emergence of a modified defense strategy, pressed harder on the physical evidence. "The fire investigator's report is conclusive, Leo. This was not an accidental fire. Accelerant was poured around your grandmother's bedroom door and windows, creating what they call a fire trap. Someone wanted to make sure she couldn't escape." The detective then produced photographs of the fire pattern analysis, followed by images from Cassie's autopsy that graphically depicted the burns on her hands and face. While his attorney objected to this tactic, the camera captured Leo leaning forward to study the images with what appeared to be clinical interest rather than distress or disgust. After nearly 4 hours of questioning, with Leo maintaining a version of events that acknowledged his presence but denied responsibility for setting the fire, Detective Wilson introduced what would become the most damning piece of evidence in the case. "We found your journal, Leo," he said, placing a plastic evidence bag containing a black composition notebook on the table. The journal, recovered from Leo's school locker, contained detailed entries describing his growing resentment toward Cassie and exploring various methods of killing her before settling on fire as the most thorough and untraceable. The entry dated just 3 days before the murder read, "Burning seems optimal. Complete destruction of evidence, potential classification as accident, and a certain finality that other methods might not guarantee. The introduction of the journal triggered the most significant reaction from Leo during the entire interrogation. His face flushed, and he lunged toward the evidence bag before his attorney physically restrained him. "That's private," he said, his voice rising for the first time. "You had no right to read that." This outburst, captured on camera from multiple angles, would later be highlighted by prosecutors as revealing Leo's true nature beneath the carefully maintained facade. In this unguarded moment, his concern centered not on the horrific content of the writings, but on the invasion of his privacy, a response that psychologists would later testify demonstrated his profound lack of empathy and moral reasoning. As the interrogation approached its 6th hour, Leo's attorney insisted on concluding the session, citing his client's status as a juvenile despite the adult charges. Before ending the questioning, Detective Wilson made one final attempt to elicit a confession, appealing to Leo's evident pride in his intelligence. "The evidence against you is overwhelming," Wilson stated calmly. "The gas purchase, the cell data, the journal, the security footage, it all tells a story of meticulous planning. I'm actually impressed by how thoroughly you thought this through, Leo. Most people your age would have made obvious mistakes." This strategic flattery, designed to appeal to Leo's narcissism, nearly succeeded as the teenager began to smile before catching himself and returning to his neutral expression. Following the formal interrogation, Leo was transferred to the juvenile section of the Miami-Dade Detention Center to await arraignment, a concession to his age despite being charged as an adult. Corrections officers reported that upon arrival, Leo requested advanced textbooks to continue his studies, expressing concern that his academic standing might suffer during his incarceration. When informed of the resources available to detainees, he complained about the limited selection, telling one officer, "I'm not like the other people in here. I had a 4.0 and was going to MIT." This comment, documented in the detention center's intake report, reflected no awareness of how his actions had permanently altered his future prospects. The Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office moved quickly to present the case to a grand jury, which returned an indictment on charges of first-degree murder with special circumstances of cruelty, arson, and false imprisonment. The decision to try Leo as an adult was formalized, with State Attorney Gabriel Hernandez personally announcing the charges at a press conference that attracted national media attention. "The evidence in this case reveals a crime of exceptional calculation and cruelty," Hernandez stated, the Miami skyline visible through the windows behind him. "The defendant's age has been taken into consideration, but the nature of his actions demands that he face the full weight of adult prosecution." While awaiting trial, Leo underwent multiple psychological evaluations, with both prosecution and defense experts attempting to understand the mindset that led to such a calculated act of violence against a caregiver. The prosecution's forensic psychologist, Dr. Elena Vasquez, concluded that Leo displayed the classic hallmarks of antisocial personality disorder with significant narcissistic traits, noting his profound lack of empathy, grandiose sense of self-worth, and inability to accept any limitation on his desires. Most troubling was her assessment that Leo viewed the murder not with remorse, but as an intellectual challenge he had successfully navigated, taking pride in the sophisticated planning that had gone into the crime. The Miami-Dade County Courthouse stood as an imposing monument to justice, its modern glass and concrete structure reflecting the bright Florida sunlight, as the most high-profile murder trial in recent memory prepared to begin. Media trucks lined the surrounding streets, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, broadcasting live updates to a national audience captivated by the case of the teenager who had burned his grandmother alive. Security was unusually tight, with additional officers posted throughout the building and spectators passing through multiple checkpoints before being admitted to the courtroom. The brutal nature of the crime, combined with the youth of the defendant, had created a perfect storm of public interest, drawing prominent legal commentators and true crime enthusiasts from across the country. Inside Courtroom 4B, Judge Maria Gonzalez presided over the final pretrial motions with a reputation for running a disciplined courtroom and zero tolerance for theatrics from either side. The veteran judge, with 27 years on the bench, had been specifically assigned to the case due to her extensive experience with both juvenile defendants and capital crimes. As she reviewed the final motions from her elevated position, her gaze occasionally shifted to Leo Phillips, seated at the defense table in a navy blue suit that had been carefully selected to emphasize his youth and diminutive stature. The transformation from his previous appearance was striking. Gone were the hooded sweatshirts and defiant posture from police photographs, replaced by a clean-cut presentation clearly designed to project innocence and vulnerability to the jury. Prosecutor Victoria Barnes moved methodically through her preparations at the state's table, her crimson blazer a deliberate choice that subtly evoked the fire at the center of the case. With a 93% conviction rate in homicide cases, Barnes was known for her meticulous preparation and ability to present complex evidence in accessible terms for jurors. Her strategy, outlined in thousands of pages of pre-trial filings, would focus on establishing the premeditated nature of the crime through a chronological presentation of Leo's planning and execution. Beside her sat Assistant State Attorney James Chen, who would handle the technical witnesses, and Detective Marcus Wilson, whose testimony would provide the narrative backbone of the state's case. Defense attorney Michael Greenberg had assembled a team that included a forensic psychologist, a fire investigation expert, and a specialist in adolescent brain development. Greenberg, whose previous career as a prosecutor gave him unique insight into the state's likely strategy, had built his defense around two central arguments. First, that Leo's traumatic childhood had fundamentally damaged his ability to process emotions and understand consequences, and second, that the fire investigation had prematurely focused on Leo to the exclusion of other potential causes. His opening statement, visible on the legal pad beside him, emphasized repeatedly that a child's brain is not a miniature adult brain, and questioned whether someone who had barely begun to live should face what amounted to a life sentence. The jury selection process had been particularly challenging, requiring 3 weeks to seat 12 jurors and 4 alternates who could approach the case without being overwhelmed by the emotional nature of the crime or prejudiced by the extensive media coverage. The final panel reflected Miami's diverse population, 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from 26 to 71, including teachers, a nurse, a retired engineer, and a college student. Judge Gonzalez had instructed them to avoid all news coverage of the case and to refrain from discussing the proceedings with anyone, even among themselves, until deliberations began, standard instructions that took on particular importance given the sensational nature of the case. At precisely 9 o'clock, the bailiff called the court to order as Leo was escorted in through a side door, his slight frame appearing even smaller against the uniformed deputies flanking him. Despite having spent 6 months in juvenile detention awaiting trial, he showed no obvious signs of the experience, maintaining the same composed demeanor that had so disturbed investigators from the beginning. The only visible emotion came when he scanned the gallery and found no familiar faces. His mother remained in rehab, his father had never been involved in his life, and his grandmother's friends had aligned themselves firmly with the prosecution, several wearing small purple ribbons in Cassie's memory. Judge Gonzalez addressed the jury directly before opening statements, her measured tone establishing the serious nature of the proceedings ahead. "You will hear evidence in this case that is disturbing and emotional," she advised, looking each juror in the eye. Your job is to evaluate this evidence objectively and determine whether the state has proven beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant committed the crimes charged. The defendant's age is not itself a defense, but you may consider it as part of the context for your deliberations. With these preliminary instructions complete, she nodded to Victoria Barnes to begin the state's opening statement. Barnes approached the jury box with deliberate steps, carrying no notes. Her opening statement had been rehearsed dozens of times until it flowed naturally. On October 3rd, Cassie Phillips went to bed in her Miami home for the last time, she began, her voice clear and measured. She took her blood pressure medication, set her alarm clock for 6 a.m. as she did every morning, and fell asleep believing she was safe in her own home. What Cassie didn't know was that her 16-year-old grandson, whom she had raised since he was 11, had spent weeks planning her murder. Barnes paused, allowing this central fact to settle with the jury before continuing. The evidence will show that Leo Phillips didn't just kill his grandmother. He chose a method specifically designed to cause maximum suffering, trapping her in her bedroom as flames engulfed her home, leaving her to die in what fire experts will testify is one of the most painful deaths imaginable. The prosecutor proceeded to outline the state's case chronologically, beginning with Leo's documented research into fire and arson 3 weeks before the murder. She walked jurors through the digital evidence, the physical preparations, and the calculated execution of the crime, emphasizing the multiple points at which Leo could have changed his mind, but instead proceeded methodically with his plan. This was not an impulsive act, Barnes stated firmly, countering the anticipated defense argument before it could be made. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment by an undeveloped brain. This was a campaign of planned actions, each building upon the last, all leading to Cassie Phillips's agonizing death. Barnes concluded by addressing Leo's youth directly, acknowledging that jurors might find it difficult to reconcile his appearance with the crime charged. "You will see a young person sitting at the defense table throughout this trial," she said, turning briefly toward Leo, who met her gaze without expression. "You may find yourselves wondering how someone so young could commit such a calculated act of cruelty. The evidence will answer that question. The evidence will show that behind that youthful exterior is someone who plotted for weeks to kill the woman who had sacrificed everything for him, someone who watched from across the street as she burned alive, and someone who has demonstrated no remorse for his actions. Age is not a shield against justice when the crime reflects the calculated reasoning of a fully formed intent to kill." When Michael Greenberg rose for the defense opening, his approach created a stark contrast with the prosecution's methodical chronology. He began by placing a framed photograph on an easel facing the jury, not of Leo as he appeared now, but of him at age 5, sitting on his mother's lap during one of her brief periods of sobriety. "Before you judge Leo Phillips, you need to know Leo Phillips," Greenberg began, his voice softer and more intimate than Barnes's prosecutorial tone. "This child was born to a mother struggling with addiction and a father who disappeared before his birth. By the time he was 8 years old, he had lived in 12 different locations, experienced periods of homelessness, and witnessed things no child should see. Drug use, violence, and neglect that rewired his developing brain in ways that experts will explain to you." Greenberg's strategy became clear as he worked to humanize Leo by detailing his early trauma, describing how the constant instability and fear had created a child who struggled to form normal attachments or process emotions in typical ways. When Cassie Phillips took custody of Leo at age 11, she did so with the best of intentions, he acknowledged, but she had no specialized training in dealing with the severe psychological damage already done. She tried traditional therapy and conventional parenting, but these approaches couldn't reach the depth of trauma Leo had experienced. This framing cleverly positioned Cassie as well-meaning, but ineffective rather than directly blaming her, while simultaneously building the foundation for their diminished capacity defense. The defense attorney then pivoted to challenge the investigation itself, suggesting that detectives had prematurely focused on Leo to the exclusion of other possibilities. The prosecution will show you selected pieces of evidence that support their narrative, he told the jury, but they won't show you the reports of previous electrical problems in the Phillips home or the faulty wiring cited in an inspection just months before the fire. They won't emphasize that the primary evidence linking Leo to the scene, the gasoline purchase, involved a common substance that millions of people buy every day for legitimate purposes. This strategy aimed to create reasonable doubt by suggesting alternative explanations for the fire while acknowledging Leo's presence near the scene. Greenberg concluded by directly addressing the most damning evidence against his client, the journal containing plans for the murder. You will see entries written by a troubled youth expressing dark thoughts and fantasies, he acknowledged. But you will also learn from experts that traumatized adolescents often use writing as a way to process difficult emotions without any intention of acting on those thoughts. The prosecution wants you to believe that these writings prove premeditation, but the science of adolescent psychology tells us that the line between fantasy and intent is far more blurred in the developing brain. With this framing, Greenberg sought to neutralize the journal's impact by recategorizing it as therapeutic expression rather than actual planning. As opening statements concluded, Judge Gonzalez instructed the prosecution to call its first witness, and Victoria Barnes announced, "The state calls Fire Captain Lorenzo Diaz." The veteran firefighter approached the stand in his dress uniform, the gravity of his expression reflecting the seriousness with which he viewed his testimony. After establishing Diaz's 23 years of experience and specialized training in arson investigation, Barnes led him through a detailed account of the fire scene, supplemented by photographs and diagrams displayed on large screens visible to the jury. Diaz's testimony established the foundational elements of the state's case, that the fire had been deliberately set, that accelerants had been strategically placed to prevent escape, and that the resulting death would have been both terrifying and excruciating. The first day of trial concluded with testimony from the medical examiner, Dr. Sophia Patel, whose clinical description of Cassie Phillips' final moments left several jurors visibly shaken. Using anatomical diagrams and autopsy photographs, the latter shown only to the jury to avoid sensationalizing the proceedings, Dr. Patel detailed the progression of Cassie's suffering as smoke inhalation damaged her lungs while flames caused third-degree burns over 60% of her body. When Barnes asked if Cassie would have been conscious during this process, Dr. Patel confirmed that evidence of soot in the deeper portions of her lungs indicated she had been breathing and aware for several minutes before losing consciousness. As this testimony unfolded, court observers noted that Leo appeared to be taking notes, his expression remaining neutral even during the most graphic descriptions. The courtroom fell to a hushed silence as school counselor Dr. Gabriela Sanchez took the stand on the fourth day of trial, her testimony anticipated as a pivotal moment in establishing Leo Phillips's state of mind before the murder. Dr. Sanchez, a licensed psychologist with 17 years of experience in the Miami-Dade school system, had worked with Leo for nearly 2 years following incidents of concerning behavior at school. Her professional demeanor and clearly organized case notes provided a compelling counterpoint to the defense's portrayal of Leo as a victim of circumstances beyond his control. "I first began working with Leo after he brought a knife to school in his freshman year," she testified, reviewing her records. "He claimed it was for a science project, but when questioned further, admitted he had brought it because another student had disrespected him." Prosecutor Victoria Barnes methodically led Dr. Sanchez through the progression of her counseling sessions with Leo, establishing a pattern that directly contradicted the defense narrative. In our initial assessment, Leo presented as highly intelligent but with concerning emotional deficits, the counselor explained, maintaining eye contact with the jury as she spoke. He could intellectually recognize what emotions would be appropriate in various situations, but reported not actually feeling those emotions himself. This clinical observation built upon the prosecution's portrait of Leo as someone who understood social norms but felt no internal obligation to follow them, capable of mimicking expected reactions without experiencing genuine empathy. Dr. Sanchez's most damning testimony came when Barnes directed her to specific sessions held in the months leading up to Cassie Phillips' murder. Approximately 3 months before the fire, Leo began asking hypothetical questions about inheritance laws and whether minors could control assets left to them, she stated, referring to her detailed session notes. When I asked why he was interested in these topics, he said he was writing a screenplay about a teenager who suddenly comes into wealth. The counselor then described how she had found the questions concerning enough to contact Cassie directly, recommending increased therapeutic support, and expressing her specific concerns about Leo's preoccupation with financial matters and his grandmother's assets. Defense attorney Michael Greenberg's cross-examination sought to reframe Dr. Sanchez's observations as evidence of Leo's trauma rather than calculation. Isn't it true, doctor, that children who've experienced severe early childhood trauma often develop atypical emotional responses as a survival mechanism? He asked, his tone conversational rather than confrontational. Sanchez acknowledged this possibility, but qualified her answer. While early trauma can certainly affect emotional development, Leo's presentation was concerning specifically because he demonstrated an understanding of appropriate emotional responses but admitted to consciously mimicking them for social advantage. This response undercut the defense's attempt to portray Leo's emotional disconnect as an uncontrollable consequence of his difficult childhood. The prosecution's case strengthened significantly when Detective Marcus Wilson took the stand to present the digital evidence recovered from Leo's devices. Using a large screen visible to the jury, Wilson methodically walked through Leo's search history in the weeks leading up to the murder, highlighting queries that created a damning timeline of premeditation. On September 12th, 3 weeks before the fire, the defendant searched for how to make a house fire look like an accident, Wilson testified, as the actual search result appeared on screen. This was followed by searches about smoke inhalation, accelerants, and specific queries about whether sleeping pills would prevent someone from waking during a fire. As this evidence was presented, several jurors visibly reacted, with one writing notes so rapidly that he requested additional paper from the court clerk. Wilson's testimony reached its most powerful moment when he introduced Cassie Phillips' hidden bedroom camera, explaining how the elderly woman had installed it out of growing fear of her grandson. Mrs. Phillips had confided in a neighbor that she sometimes woke to find items in her room disturbed or moved, Wilson explained. Acting on this concern, she purchased a camera disguised as a bedside clock, which uploaded footage to a cloud storage account. Barnes then played the final video recovered from this account, showing Leo entering Cassie's bedroom on the night of the fire, making eye contact with his sleeping grandmother, and then quietly closing and locking the door from the outside. The timestamp on the footage showed this occurring just 17 minutes before the first 911 call reporting the fire. The defense team's fire investigation expert, Dr. Raymond Chen, attempted to counter the prosecution's arson evidence by suggesting alternative explanations for the fire pattern. The prosecution's experts have interpreted the burn patterns as indicating deliberately poured accelerants, Dr. Chen testified. But similar patterns can result from natural phenomena called flashover, where extreme heat causes furniture and other materials to release their own flammable gases. This technical testimony aimed to create reasonable doubt about the fire's cause, but Chen's effectiveness was severely undermined during cross-examination when Barnes produced records showing he had been professionally censured in 2 previous cases for reaching conclusions not supported by evidence. The case took an unexpected turn when Jason Miller, Leo's friend and initial alibi, took the stand as a prosecution witness rather than a defense witness. The 17-year-old appeared visibly nervous, avoiding eye contact with Leo as he described their friendship and the events leading up to the fire. Leo started talking about his grandmother in a weird way about a month before it happened, Miller testified, fidgeting with the sleeve of his dress shirt. He kept saying she was controlling his life and his money, and that once she was gone, he'd be free to live how he wanted. Miller then described a specific conversation that had occurred 2 weeks before the fire, in which Leo had discussed hypothetical methods of killing someone and asked which would be least traceable. Miller's testimony became particularly damning when he described Leo's behavior on the night of the fire. He came over to play video games, but he seemed distracted and kept checking the time, Miller recounted. Around 10:30, he said he had to leave for a bit, but would be back later to spend the night, like we'd planned. Miller then confirmed that Leo had specifically asked him to tell anyone who asked that they had been together all evening, initially claiming it was because he wanted to meet a girl his grandmother disapproved of. When I heard about the fire the next morning, I texted him asking if his grandmother was okay, and he just wrote back, "It's handled." That's when I knew something was really wrong. The prosecution's case reached its emotional zenith with the testimony of Gloria Martinez, Cassie Phillips's closest friend and fellow retired teacher. The elderly woman dabbed at tears as she described Cassie's growing fears in the weeks before her death. "She called me 3 days before the fire, more upset than I'd ever heard her," Martinez testified, her voice breaking slightly. She said she'd found a journal in Leo's room while putting away laundry, and what she read terrified her. "She told me, 'If anything happens to me, Gloria, you make sure they look at Leo.'" This hearsay testimony had been admitted over defense objections as an excited utterance exception, and its impact on the jury was palpable, with several members glancing toward Leo with visible dismay. The defense case began with testimony from Dr. Lydia Hoffman, a specialist in adolescent neurodevelopment who used colorful brain scans and diagrams to explain the immature state of the teenage brain. The prefrontal cortex, which governs impulse control and consequence evaluation, isn't fully developed until the mid-20s, she testified, pointing to areas on the displayed images. In adolescents who have experienced significant trauma, this development can be further delayed or impaired. This scientific foundation supported the defense's central argument that Leo's actions should be viewed through the lens of his incomplete brain development and traumatic history, rather than judged by adult standards of premeditation and moral reasoning. The most anticipated testimony came when Leo Phillips himself took the stand against his attorney's reported advice. Dressed in a light blue shirt that emphasized his youth, Leo spoke in clear, measured tones as he described his childhood with his addicted mother and the subsequent transition to living with his grandmother. He acknowledged the behavioral issues noted by school officials, but attributed them to difficulty adjusting to Cassie's strict and controlling parenting style after years of virtual independence. When asked directly about the fire, Leo offered an alternative explanation that contradicted his previous statements to investigators. "I did buy the gasoline, but it was for a science experiment about combustion rates that I was working on for an independent study project. I left it in the garage when I went to Jason's house that night." Under cross-examination, Barnes methodically dismantled Leo's new narrative, highlighting inconsistencies with his previous statements and the physical evidence. You testified that you bought gasoline for a science project, yet no such project was ever assigned or approved by your teachers, was it? She asked, referring to school records already in evidence. When Leo claimed the project was self-directed, Barnes produced his internet search history, asking, "Can you explain how searches for how to prevent someone waking up during a fire related to your combustion experiment?" As the cross-examination continued, Leo's composed demeanor began to crack, with flashes of anger breaking through his carefully maintained facade, particularly when Barnes questioned his claim of caring for his grandmother while presenting evidence of his internet shopping searches made the day after her death. The most damaging moment in Leo's testimony came when Barnes presented his journal, asking him to read selected entries aloud to the jury. Despite objections from his attorney, Judge Gonzalez ruled that since Leo had chosen to testify, he had opened himself to this line of questioning. Visibly reluctant, Leo read his own words from 3 days before the murder. "The fire option seems optimal: complete destruction of evidence, potential classification as accident, and the bonus of knowing exactly how it ends. Once she's gone, everything that's rightfully mine will finally be under my control." When asked to explain these words, Leo claimed they were just creative writing exercises and ways to process my feelings, not actual plans. But the damage to his credibility appeared irreparable as jurors exchanged glances during his explanation. The final witness in the case was Dr. Elena Vasquez, the prosecution's forensic psychologist, who had evaluated Leo following his arrest. Her testimony directly countered the defense's diminished capacity argument by distinguishing between neurological development and moral awareness. "While adolescent brains are indeed still developing," she explained, "the evidence in this case demonstrates that Leo Phillips fully understood the wrongfulness of his actions and took sophisticated steps to avoid detection." Dr. Vasquez then detailed specific examples from the evidence that demonstrated Leo's capacity for advanced planning, his understanding of cause and effect, and his ability to anticipate the consequences of his actions. All indicators that, despite his age, he possessed the cognitive capacity to form specific intent and premeditation. As testimony concluded on the 10th day of trial, Judge Gonzalez instructed the attorneys to prepare their closing arguments for the following morning. The evidence phase of the trial had painted two starkly different portraits of Leo Phillips: the prosecution's version of a calculating, remorseless killer who had methodically planned his grandmother's torture and death for financial gain, and the defense's portrayal of a traumatized youth with underdeveloped impulse control who had acted from a place of psychological damage rather than genuine malice. The jury would now be tasked with determining which version they believed beyond a reasonable doubt, with a teenager's future hanging in the balance alongside justice for a grandmother who had died in unimaginable agony. A palpable tension filled courtroom 4B as Judge Maria Gonzalez instructed the jury on the morning of deliberations, her measured voice the only sound in the otherwise silent room. "You must consider all evidence presented during this trial and determine whether the state has proven beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant committed the crimes charged," she explained, reviewing the legal standards for first-degree murder, arson, and the special circumstance of exceptional cruelty. The defendant's age is not itself a defense to these charges, but you may consider it as context for your evaluation of his actions and intent. As the judge completed her instructions, Leo Phillips sat unnaturally still at the defense table, his expression blank as it had been throughout most of the proceedings, offering no visible indication of the gravity of the moment. The jury filed out at 10:17 in the morning to begin what many legal observers predicted would be lengthy deliberations given the complexity of the case and the youth of the defendant. The courtroom, which had been filled to capacity every day of The 2-week trial slowly emptied as spectators and media representatives moved to the courthouse lobby to await what most assumed would be hours or even days of jury discussions. Victoria Barnes and her prosecution team retreated to a conference room on the 5th floor, while Michael Greenberg and his defense colleagues gathered in a small attorney consultation room, both sides maintaining the professional separation that had characterized their interactions throughout the trial, despite the intense adversarial nature of their courtroom battle. To the surprise of everyone involved, the jury buzzed for the bailiff at 3:42 that same afternoon, having deliberated for just over 5 hours, an extraordinarily brief period considering the serious nature of the charges and the volume of evidence presented. Judge Gonzalez ordered the courtroom cleared of all spectators while the jury was seated, a precautionary measure given the high-profile nature of the case and the emotions involved. Court officers positioned themselves strategically around the room as Leo was escorted back to his place at the defense table, his attorney leaning in to whisper final words of preparation for whatever verdict might come. For the first time since his arrest, a flicker of genuine emotion crossed Leo's face. Not fear or remorse, observers noted, but something closer to impatience, as if the proceedings were an inconvenience delaying his return to more interesting activities. Judge Gonzalez addressed the jury foreperson, a 53-year-old elementary school teacher whose expression revealed nothing of the decision they had reached. "Has the jury reached a verdict on all counts?" the judge inquired, her voice formal and measured. "We have, Your Honor," the foreperson replied, handing the verdict forms to the bailiff, who delivered them to the bench. Judge Gonzalez reviewed the documents briefly, her expression remaining professionally neutral despite the gravity of the moment. The courtroom seemed to collectively hold its breath as she handed the forms to the clerk for reading, the only sound, the soft rustling of paper and the distant hum of the building's air conditioning system. In case number 2023 CF 7521, State of Florida versus Leo Phillips, on the count of murder in the first degree with special circumstances of cruelty, we the jury find the defendant. The clerk paused almost imperceptibly, the weight of the moment seeming to affect even this veteran court official, guilty as charged. The word hung in the air for a moment before the clerk continued, "On the count of arson in the first degree, we the jury find the defendant guilty as charged. On the count of false imprisonment, we the jury find the defendant guilty as charged." With each pronouncement, several jurors looked directly at Leo, perhaps searching for some sign of remorse or recognition of the seriousness of the moment. But his expression remained largely unchanged, his posture stiff and his gaze fixed straight ahead. The defense immediately requested that the jury be polled, a standard procedure to ensure unanimity, and each juror in turn confirmed their agreement with the verdict. Michael Greenberg placed a steadying hand on Leo's shoulder as the process unfolded. Though the teenager appeared to require no such comfort, his demeanor suggesting more annoyance than distress. Judge Gonzalez thanked the jury for their service and scheduled the sentencing hearing for 2 weeks later, ordering that Leo be held without bail at the juvenile section of the Miami-Dade Detention Center, despite his conviction as an adult, a final concession to his physical age, even as the legal system had judged him by adult standards of accountability. The sentencing hearing held on December 18th drew even more media attention than the trial itself, with national news networks broadcasting live from outside the courthouse as legal experts debated the appropriate punishment for a 16-year-old convicted of such a heinous crime. Inside the courtroom, Victoria Barnes presented the state's recommendation for the maximum possible sentence, arguing that the premeditated and exceptionally cruel nature of the crime warranted no leniency despite the defendant's age. Cassie Phillips suffered a death so horrific that veteran first responders were traumatized by what they witnessed, she reminded the court. She died at the hands of someone she had sacrificed everything to raise and protect, someone who watched her burn alive without making any attempt to save her, someone who has demonstrated no remorse at any point during these proceedings. The defense countered with a plea for judicial recognition of Leo's age and potential for rehabilitation, presenting expert testimony about adolescent brain development and the possibility of significant psychological change during the remaining years of maturation. The law recognizes that juveniles are different from adults, Greenberg argued, and while the jury has found Leo responsible for these terrible acts, the court has the power to craft a sentence that acknowledges both the severity of the crime and the unique capacity of youth for redemption and change. He recommended a 30-year sentence with mandatory psychological treatment, arguing that this would balance the needs of justice with recognition of Leo's incomplete development and potential for eventual rehabilitation. Judge Gonzalez permitted victim impact statements before pronouncing sentence, creating some of the most emotionally powerful moments of the entire proceedings. Gloria Martinez, Cassie's closest friend, spoke directly to Leo as she described the loss felt by the community and Cassie's former students. "She loved you unconditionally," Martinez said, her voice breaking with emotion. "She changed her entire retirement to give you a home. She advocated for you at school. She spent her savings on your therapy, and she never stopped, believing you could have a good future." Martinez then held up a small ceramic planter, explaining that Cassie's third-grade students made it for her retirement. "She kept this on her bedside table right next to where you saw her sleeping before you locked her in to die." When offered the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, Leo rose and delivered a statement that many observers later described as more harmful than silence would have been. "I recognize that my actions have had serious consequences," he began in a measured tone that seemed rehearsed rather than heartfelt. "And I understand that the court must respond accordingly." Rather than expressing remorse for his grandmother's suffering, he focused primarily on his own lost opportunities, noting that his academic potential will be wasted by a lengthy incarceration, and suggesting that society would benefit more from my eventual contributions than from my extended punishment. The statement concluded with what appeared to be his first acknowledgment of the harm caused, though it stopped short of a direct apology. "I regret that my grandmother's life ended the way it did, and I wish circumstances had been different for both of us." Judge Gonzalez's sentencing decision silenced the courtroom, her decades of judicial experience evident in the careful, measured way she explained her reasoning. "The court has considered all factors relevant to this case, including the defendant's age, the expert testimony regarding adolescent brain development, the nature and circumstances of the crime, and the impact on the victim and community," she began, her gaze moving between Leo and her written notes. "While our legal system does recognize the unique position of juvenile offenders and their capacity for change, it also acknowledges that some crimes are so heinous, so calculated, and so cruel that they demand the most serious consequences available under law, regardless of the perpetrator's age," the judge continued, addressing Leo directly as she delivered her decision. The evidence presented at trial demonstrated not a momentary lapse in judgment or an impulsive act, but weeks of careful planning deliberately designed to cause maximum suffering to the person who had devoted her life to your care. The premeditation was extensive, the method chosen was exceptionally cruel, and your behavior both during and after the crime showed a disturbing lack of empathy or remorse. She paused briefly, her expression grave, as she delivered the final judgment. "For the crime of first-degree murder with special circumstances of cruelty, this court sentences you to 70 years in the Florida Department of Corrections. For the crimes of arson and false imprisonment, you are sentenced to 30 years each, to be served concurrently with the murder sentence." Audible gasps filled the courtroom at the severity of the sentence, effectively a life term for a 16-year-old. The judge added specific, provisions requiring psychological treatment throughout Leo's incarceration and mandating that he serve the first 15 years in a specialized juvenile adult transition facility before transfer to the general adult prison population. This sentence reflects both the exceptional cruelty of your crime and the possibility, however remote, of eventual rehabilitation, Judge Gonzalez concluded. It ensures that you will have access to necessary treatment while protecting society from the demonstrated danger you present. The reactions to the verdict and sentence revealed deep divisions in how the public viewed the appropriate handling of juvenile offenders who commit adult crimes. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered with signs bearing competing messages, some reading, "Justice for Cassie," and others proclaiming, "Children deserve second chances," and 70 years for a 16-year-old is cruel. Legal experts appearing on national news programs debated whether the sentence represented appropriate consequences for an exceptionally heinous crime or an overly punitive response that failed to account for adolescent development and the potential for rehabilitation. The case quickly became a flashpoint in ongoing national conversations about juvenile justice reform. Cassie Phillips's former students organized a memorial service at Palmetto Elementary School, where a garden was dedicated in her name, and a scholarship fund established for underprivileged children interested in education careers. During the ceremony, dozens of former students shared stories about Mrs. Phillips and the lasting impact she had made on their lives. The school principal announced that the annual Teaching Excellence Award would be renamed in Cassie's honor, ensuring that her legacy of dedication to children would continue despite the tragic irony that she had died at the hands of the child she had most tried to help. While being processed for transfer to the Juvenile Adult Transition Facility, where he would begin serving his sentence, Leo Phillips reportedly asked a corrections officer if the prison had advanced placement courses or if he would be limited to general education classes. This final anecdote, reported by several news outlets, seemed to encapsulate what many viewed as his fundamental disconnection from the gravity of his actions and their consequences. A 16-year-old with extraordinary intellectual capabilities, but a profound absence of the moral and emotional development that defines humanity at its most basic level. His case would go on to be studied in criminology and psychology courses as an example of adolescent psychopathy and the ongoing questions about culpability, punishment, and the possibilities of rehabilitation in the juvenile justice system. 6 months after Leo Phillips received his 70-year sentence, the case continued to reverberate through the juvenile justice system in Florida and beyond. Legal scholars published analyses examining the precedent set by Judge Gonzalez's decision, with some arguing it represented an appropriate response to an exceptionally cruel crime, while others contended it reflected a troubling return to treating juvenile offenders as miniature adults, despite scientific evidence about brain development. The Florida Supreme Court agreed to hear an appeal based on the defense's argument that the sentence constituted de facto life imprisonment for a juvenile offender, potentially violating constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. The pending appeal ensured that Leo Phillips would remain a focal point in the national conversation about juvenile justice for years to come. The Miami-Dade County School District implemented a comprehensive review of its protocols for identifying and addressing concerning behavior in students, directly citing the Phillips case as evidence that existing systems had failed to recognize escalating warning signs. School counselor Dr. Gabriela Sanchez, whose testimony had been central to the prosecution's case, was appointed to lead a task force developing new guidelines for intervention when students displayed warning signs similar to Leo's. Cassie Phillips did everything right as a guardian, Dr. Sanchez explained during a school board meeting. She attended every meeting, followed every recommendation, and still found herself without the support she desperately needed. We must create systems that don't just identify concerning behavior, but actually provide meaningful intervention before tragedy occurs. Cassie Phillips's modest home, rebuilt after the fire, became an unexpected touchpoint for community healing when her estate donated the property to a nonprofit organization providing transitional housing for families recovering from addiction. The Cassie Phillips Family Recovery Center opened exactly 1 year after her death, offering 6 families at a time a stable place to live while parents completed rehabilitation programs and children received specialized support services. The center's director, Maria Vasquez, described the program as embodying Cassie's lifelong commitment to giving children a chance at a better future, regardless of the circumstances they were born into. Each family apartment contained a small bookshelf filled with children's literature, a nod to Cassie's passion for fostering literacy in young people. The ripple effects of the case extended to the Miami-Dade Fire Department, where several first responders who had witnessed the aftermath of Cassie's death sought psychological support for post-traumatic stress. Fire Captain Lorenzo Diaz, whose powerful testimony had helped secure Leo's conviction, became an advocate for increased mental health resources for emergency personnel exposed to particularly traumatic scenes. We're trained to handle difficult situations, but some cases break through even the strongest defenses, Diaz explained in an interview with the Miami Herald. What happened to Mrs. Phillips was beyond the scope of what even veteran firefighters should have to process alone. The department subsequently implemented mandatory debriefing sessions after particularly traumatic calls and expanded access to confidential counseling services. Inside the Juvenile Adult Transition Facility, where Leo began serving his sentence, staff reported that he had quickly established himself as academically gifted but socially isolated. According to quarterly reports filed with the court, he excelled in the limited educational programs available, completing his high school equivalency examination with perfect scores across all subjects. However, these same reports noted his continued lack of empathy in therapy sessions and his tendency to manipulate less intelligent inmates for personal advantage. One evaluating psychologist wrote, "Subject demonstrates exceptional cognitive abilities paired with profound emotional deficits. He intellectually understands the concepts of remorse and empathy, but shows no evidence of genuinely experiencing these emotions, instead viewing them as social constructs to be mimicked when advantageous." The psychological community found in Leo Phillips a case study that challenged existing frameworks for understanding adolescent criminality. Dr. Elena Vasquez, who had evaluated Leo for the prosecution, published a peer-reviewed paper examining the intersection of high intelligence, antisocial personality traits, and adolescent development. The Phillips case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil and its manifestation in youth, she wrote. While adolescent brain science correctly identifies limitations in impulse control and consequence evaluation, it must also account for cases where these typical developmental issues are accompanied by a fundamental absence of normal human empathy and moral reasoning. Her work initiated a broader reconsideration of how the justice system might distinguish between typical adolescent risk-taking behavior and the more concerning patterns exemplified by Leo. Cassie Phillips's daughter Lisa, who had been in rehabilitation during the trial and sentencing, emerged from treatment to face the dual trauma of losing her mother and seeing her son imprisoned for life. With the support of a specialized grief counselor, Lisa made the difficult decision to write to Leo, expressing both her love for him as her child and her horror at what he had done. "Your grandmother saved my life by taking you in when I couldn't be a mother to you," she wrote in a letter later included in court documents. She gave everything she had to give you a chance at a good life, and I will never understand how you could repay that love with such cruelty." Lisa eventually became an advocate for families affected by violent crime, speaking particularly to parents and grandparents struggling with the complex emotions of loving someone who has committed horrific acts. The legal precedent established by the Phillips case influenced charging and sentencing decisions in juvenile cases across Florida and beyond. Prosecutors in several jurisdictions cited Judge Gonzalez's reasoning when seeking adult charges for juvenile offenders in cases involving premeditated violence, while defense attorneys developed new strategies centered on neurodevelopmental evidence to counter these efforts. The Florida legislature convened special hearings on juvenile justice reform with expert witnesses from both the prosecution and defense teams testifying about the lessons learned from the Phillips case. These hearings ultimately resulted in the Cassie Phillips Act, which increased funding for early intervention programs for at-risk youth, while maintaining the option of adult sentences for the most serious juvenile offenders. 2 years after the trial, Detective Marcus Wilson participated in the development of a specialized training program for law enforcement officers investigating crimes committed by juveniles. The program emphasized the recognition of warning signs that might indicate a progression toward violence and provided guidelines for age-appropriate interrogation techniques that would stand up to legal scrutiny. The Phillips case was exceptional in many ways, Wilson explained to a class of detectives, but it also highlighted systematic failures in how we identify and respond to dangerous behavior in young people. A 16-year-old doesn't develop the capacity to commit a crime of this magnitude overnight. There are always signs, and we need to get better at seeing them before it's too late. The most enduring legacy of the case emerged not from the criminal justice system, but from the educational community where Cassie Phillips had spent her career. The Cassie Phillips Foundation, established with donations that poured in after her death, developed a nationwide program focusing on early intervention for children showing signs of emotional disturbance and antisocial behavior. The Foundation's approach emphasized identification of at-risk children as early as elementary school, providing comprehensive support, including specialized therapy, mentorship, and family resources. Cassie believed every child deserved a chance at a good life, explained Gloria Martinez, who served as the Foundation's board chairperson. The greatest tribute to her memory is creating systems that might prevent another child from following the path that Leo took, not just for potential victims' sake, but for those children themselves. 5 years after the murder, as legal appeals continued to work through the system, journalists seeking to interview Leo Phillips reported a disturbing evolution in his self-perception. Rather than expressing remorse or acknowledging the impact of his actions, he had begun to embrace his notoriety, requesting that interviewers refer to him as the Burning Boy, a moniker coined by a tabloid shortly after his arrest. Prison officials noted his collection of news clippings about his case and his frequent references to other infamous teenage killers, suggesting he viewed himself as part of a dark legacy. This development reinforced for many the appropriateness of his lengthy sentence, while others pointed to it as evidence of the system's failure to provide meaningful rehabilitation opportunities for even the most disturbed juvenile offenders. Broader questions about family dynamics, mental health intervention, and the responsibilities of various systems came into sharper focus through scholarly analysis of the case. Sociologists noted that Cassie Phillips had done everything society expects of a responsible guardian, seeking professional help, cooperating with school authorities, and providing structure and stability, yet still found herself without adequate support as Leo's behavior deteriorated. Mental health advocates pointed to the case as evidence of critical gaps in services for families dealing with potentially dangerous adolescents, particularly when those young people possess the intelligence to manipulate the systems designed to help them. The case ultimately sparked a national conversation about the limitations of our current approaches to juvenile mental health and the need for more effective early intervention strategies. Miami's Coral Gables Senior High School, where Leo had been a student, implemented comprehensive changes to address the failures illuminated by his case. The school established a threat assessment team comprising counselors, administrators, and a school resource officer, meeting weekly to review concerning student behavior and coordinate appropriate interventions. Additionally, the school developed an anonymous reporting system, allowing students to safely share concerns about peers who might be exhibiting warning signs of violence or extreme distress. We cannot change what happened to Mrs. Phillips, Principal Javier Rodriguez explained at a parent meeting introducing these new measures, but we can honor her memory by creating systems that might prevent similar tragedies in the future. The final and perhaps most meaningful legacy emerged from the hundreds of former students whose lives Cassie Phillips had touched during her 42 years of teaching. On what would have been her 70th birthday, more than 300 former students gathered at Palmetto Elementary School to dedicate a memorial garden and share stories of her impact on their lives. Among them was Carlos Mendez, once a struggling third grader in Cassie's class, now a kindergarten teacher himself. "Mrs. Phillips saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself," he told the assembled crowd, many wiping away tears. "She taught me that every child deserves someone who believes in their potential, no matter what challenges they face. That's why I became a teacher, to pass on that same gift she gave to me." In this way, Cassie Phillips's legacy of nurturing and believing in children continued to spread outward in ripples of positive influence, a powerful counterpoint to the singular act of violence that had ended her life, but could not diminish the good she had brought into the world.